The Korean War started in the year 1950. The world nations were suffering from severe crisis after the Second World War, the time converging into one more adversity, that is the Cold War. World nations were in a panic for many catastrophes to hit the humankind artificially sooner or later with the advent of the modern inventions in the name of thermonuclear weaponry. One of the significant wars that has close relations with the Cold War tensions and happened during the Cold War era is the Korean War. Cuban Missile conflicts and the Vietnam Wars intense with stats that is more significant. They call it hence to be a forgotten war by the Americans. The media did not expose too much about the Korean War for one reason or the other, just like how it did in the case of the Vietnam War or the Cuban Missile conflicts. Geographical divisions in the country led to the political divisions too, later on to become permanently as two different nations, North Korea and South Korea. USA and USSR agreed to maintain the 38th Parallel Border Pact to guard the South and the North respectively, just after the Second World War. UK, USA and the USSR were the allies in the Second World War who took the decision against Japan. It was done forcefully to get rid of all those Japanese who lived in the Korean peninsula. Without any brutal military forces, the region was split into two territories in the peninsula. Yet it was not expected to rise into a colossal issue eventually to the heights of the Korean War. Historians are quoting so many reasons for the outbreak of the Korean War. Stalin's influence on the North Korean part was considered as a major reason for the outbreak of the war. At the same time, the concern for China for the USA to have better control of the southern part of Korea was clearly a vivid point not to forget there as well. Is in the nationalism of the locals or the imperialism of the foreign nations that has been a catalyst for the Korean War is a true subject, matter or research even today for the historians. Let us see the intricate details of this significant war in the history of the humankind so far. Korean War between North and South Korea never ended, as there were not any agreeable pacts or peace agreements signed by countries, neither before nor after the war. Armed troops for the communists packed North Korea arrived at South Korea to set launch the War of Korea. UN controlled and directed USA was quick enough to sprang only to the South Korea's defense to fight a bloody and distressing war for about 3 years or so. Before that, Korea was under the possession of Japan. Just after the Second World War, Korea was purely divided into zones of occupation by the Japanese for trading convenience. In fact, they used it as one of their imperial colonies for a long time, all until granting freedom to the country as a whole. Yet the United States forces finally decided to surrender to the Japanese troops in the South Korea, while the Russian forces decided to do the same there in the North Korea. The temporary division between the zones eventually became a permanent separation, just like how Germany was divided into two earlier. North Korea became a communist regime with the assistance of the Soviet Union. USA was the major source to assist the South Korean part with enough military power and financial power too. The prowess of the two developed nations and the Cold War between these two fueled the fire, and that ended up being one big Korean War. It was on June 25th of the year 1950 when it all really began, when the troops from North Korea gave surprise to the South Korean army all of a sudden. At that point of time, the USA troops were stationed in South Korea. This made USA to force and pass a resolution in the UN Security Council. This is to get the military assistance for the South Korean territory. Russia boycotted the veto. In fact, the Security Council was not paid heed by the Russians at that point of time. Keeping the resolution in hand, the president by then, Mr. Truman, quickly dispatched troops through air route and through land route and by naval forces to Korea. This was referred by the president of the USA at that point of time as an inevitable need for police action. USA and its role. It is this intervention from the USA that really kindled the start. South Korean forces along with US forces marched towards North Korea. Communist Chinese troops intervened in between too. This is why the Korean War soon lost its fierceness and ended up in a bloody stalemate. Ceasefire was quickly announced by the forces of the USA and the North Korea to end the conflict. Because of the ceasefire, there come in an agreement to keep both the territories separate forever as North Korea and South Korea. Signatories of the war in Korea. China, USA and Korea were the signatories for the Korean War. The armistice actually brought the positive results finally, even though South Korea was not actually willing to agree any of the pact suggested. Buffer zone was created between both the nations to have a demilitarized area in between the two nations' borders. The North agreed armistice treaty and the South Korean governments posed the war. Kim II Sung. Everyone that traces the history books of records will find the name Kim II Sung so easily, for he is the greedy emperor of the Northern Korea who actually tried to conquer the South Korea to have kindled the Korean War later on. The attempt to invade South Korea by the Northern Emperor Kim II Sung actually kindled the interests of the Americans to protect South Korea from being imperialized by the emperor. This move from the Americans, in turn, kindled the attention of the Russians, as it was during the Cold War period the invasions happened in the borders of the South Korean districts. Stalin and his communism spread all over in the northern part of Korea, which had a major influence there in the invasion to convert the South Koreans and their philosophies to communism actively. The objective was clear, which was well resisted with hatred and suspicion by the South Korean rulers. Each one who sympathized the communists were killed or sent to prison by the South Korean rulers. Stalin or Kim? It is not possible to draw a distinct line of discretion to point fingers either at Kim or at Stalin to be a major reason to have brought the situation to such worst scenarios later on for a war to break out because of their individual influences. China played a big role here as well. USA had deep concern to support China in its very moves without delay, as it was supporting based for the Americans to do all secret activities to watch the Russians. The spy work was facilitated with their operations advocated by the Chinese supporters. Therefore, the Cold War tensions have big relations to the Korean War outbreak as such. Basic conflict. Even several years ahead of the war, there were deep hatred and suspicion amidst the two groups that lived separately in the north and the south of the Korean peninsula right after the split between the two territories that happened in the year 1945, when the Japanese reign ended after the Second World War. It was for 35 years almost Japan was ruling the Korean nation and exploiting many natural resources from the northern territories for its own personal benefits too. The Northern Territory received major attention by the Japanese to come forward with any type of reforms, as there were real resources for exploitation. The South, on the other hand, had least resources, and as a result it was given least recognition or attention. This was the root cause of the evil. 35 years of such decline, growth and sustenance in the southern part of Korea made the southerners to look at the northern part of the country to be in commandeering position. They assumed their authority quite brutal and very uncouth. To the contrary, people who belonged to the developed north started to see the southerners to be decant or effete. That led to the formal split eventually once the Japanese regime ended. During the beginning stages of the Cold War, the North and the Southern territories chose themselves to be supporting the opposite parties out of their own interests naturally. So when the war outbreak, the support naturally came in from two opponents of the Cold War for either territories to kindle the chances for the Second World War. Role of General Eisenhower. Korean War continued to be fought with vengeance for more than 3 years, and finally, in the major interests of the commons to bring in world peace at the earliest, it was the general of the USA Army at that time, D. Eisenhower, the General Dwight, who forced the pact agreement and to announce ceasefire soon. Unsigned nation is South Korea towards peace, as they had many queries to add on to their end. China and the US, including North Korea, signed the peace agreement to cease fire, while the South Koreans are not interested in doing so, even all until now. That is the reason the two nations are said to be in war ever since 1953. The DMZ. Territories that is maintained in between the borders of any two nations to maintain the security standards and to bring in peace is called as the demilitarized zone. The span of this region in the Korean peninsula spans to about 243 kilometers at a stretch. This is invaded by some endangered species on Earth today, but not intercepted or dared to enter by groups, for the sole reason that there are no military troops allowed to enter into this zone. The thickest of the forest is one major threat for any trained military men to pass through with any type of advanced machines in hand today. There are no commutes possible by land that easily, as there are hardly any roads that is seen to be available to get through to the other side of the thick forest area today. Years before there were roads, but no one can see these roads today, as there are so many developments that had happened in the recent times in the floral growth in these areas in all these years, right after the formation of the DMZ. It is one of the most sensitive areas of the map in Asia, where one may not find human intervention to happen so easily. Easiest methods to pass through this region in particular could just be the air route, which almost takes no time to pass through this small passage of about less than 300 kilometers or so. Anyhow, when someone does that, then there are all chances that they fall in the radar precisely and accurately to be spotted clearly by the military surveillance readily in either ends. There are hundreds of species that have taken their own refuge in this locality, and the environmentalists are longing to offer conversation to these species in this particular DMZ. Negotiations are going on to come to agreement, but it is not happening as the war is still open in all these years, as South Korea has not signed the peace agreement all now yet. It is easy to ascertain that can be no more heavy animals that are likely to live in the location, because there were about 1 million land mines that were buried in the forest since all these years. If there are so many land mines, then the ideal behind burying so many can be understood obviously though. The 90,000 troops were anticipated to invade the South Koreans during the yesteryears that were targeted by the defense forces to have buried so many landmines with earnest efforts. That goes to show that there is no possibility for any endangered species of the heaviest kind to still survive in this zone as freely as all these animals of the heavy kind have all the possibilities to have caught in the landmines and be dead already. Therefore, naturally, the left-out species would just be the reptiles, or the fauna, or the birds and fishes of the novel kind. Some of the animals, birds and reptiles, or even the amphibians that are said to be extinct in the regions of South and North Korea, are found to have gotten enough shelter in this zone of DMZ, which is called as the best military edifice that is not destroyed at all now yet, even after the Second World War. The population of Korea is the thickest just because of these reasons too. More than 1,000 people live in every single square kilometre and even lesser arena today, to make it difficult for them to not to bother about acquiring and exploiting the resources of one another. That is why there comes in the need for negotiations from the foreign nations often, and Americans are good at it since so many years now. Level of conflict. Currently, the level and serious nature of the conflict is higher. Recently, the United Nations ambassador was shot dead in a North Korean province. Farmers from North Korea are being kidnapped, and many more instances show the instability in the province in all these years of Korean War. Dispute and the fatality rates. When the dispute and its cause was still on research today by the historians to draw out all those potential possibilities and correlate that with the outbreak of the significant Korean War, consequences were not limited or stoppable by any means whatsoever. Despite the fact that the most prolific and the powerful nations were involved in the affair to resolve dispute or to bring in peace, or in the name of doing so, there was not any help to the innocent civilians who lost lives in millions in the war. It happened for the soldiers to lose their career, lives, limbs and so on. It happened for so many families to be buried once for all, without any traces whatsoever, just because of the ill thoughts and moves taken without any strategic application by some of the leaders who had commanding authority in the Korean side in particular. Massacres were embarked in the history book of records, but for what use when there were so many lives lost already? Pathetic such historical references must be a guide to the upcoming generations as foolproof evidence to emphasis on the ethics. Level of strategic disputes. Volatility in the Korean peninsula was the major reason for the dispute initially. There was huge uncertainty prevailing in the way whether or not a valid bioreserve would be considered. Other group takes environmental benefits associated towards the DMZ of Korea into essential consideration here. This is what that had escalated the issue to the higher levels internationally, seeking for a peace pact agreement. Yet the situation at that time was worse. Neither the communists were giving it up, nor were the South Koreans agreeable to any peace solutions. The war was on the cards. Outcome of dispute. When the dispute broke out earlier, the time was wrong for them to cash upon the wrong supporting hands to seek assistance and arsenal. That was during the Cold War, and hence they resorted to the assistance of the opposite parties that were involved in the Cold War. USA, USSR and UK were the allies that won successfully in the Second World War, but that did not extend it for prolonged time though. The Cold War era began to gain dominance over each other between the USSR and the UK. Under these conditions, when the intensity of the Cold War was almost at its peak time, both Korean territories sought after assistance from the opposite rivals of the Cold War. That was a major reason for a serious war to break out naturally, without coming to any amiable solutions instantly, in spite of the negotiations that were made for peace by the United Nations. In fact, the emergency called for in the Korean peninsula for instant military assistance was forced and obtained by the President of America at that point of time, Mr. Truman. If that was a strategic move to keep hold of China's support without letting them to seek the assistance of the USSR, which is in proximity. Diplomatic such moves to support China, which came from the USA, kindled the curiosity of the Russians to extend instant support with the North Korean communists. The real war of agony. Communists based northern half of the Korean peninsula, and the Americans influenced southern half, exactly divided at the 38 parallel. Soviet tanks overran the territory belonged to South Korea, and when that happened, the United States of America intervened and came to the rescue or aid of South Korea. After the Second World War was over, General Douglas MacArthur oversaw the Japanese occupations. Southernmost tip of the Korean peninsula is where the American troops were instructed to move on by General Douglas MacArthur to take hold of the surging North Koreans out there. It was exactly at Pusan. Korea was not the target at all for the USA, though. Policymakers, at that moment during that stage of the Cold War, were not interested in going soft against the growth of communism in part of the world for that matter. Through the international peace-keeping force of the United Nations as part of the police team, arrived the USA to this part of the world to support South Korea. Even though the interests and the ultimate best objectives behind the move are not predictable for anyone at that stage, the influence of the Americans in the United Nations was evident with these strategic steps taken forward to maintain their supremacy all over the world against the Russians. The war hero General Douglas MacArthur. So naturally, the forces of the UN and the US and the ROK, which is now the South Korean part, joined together in the shores of Pusan under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. The assault daringly began on Incheon, which is actually a port in the Korean western coastal regions. General Douglas MacArthur almost crushed the whole of the North Korean army in that region as soon as he landed in the territory. Seoul was recaptured in no time. Without getting satisfied with what they conquered already, the ambitious General Douglas MacArthur went ahead to move forward deeper. The innermost part of the North Korean provinces were also targeted eventually. Seeing this move from the USA, Chinese was alerted. The People's Republic of China assumed that the Americans are choosing North Korea to be their own base against Manchuria. Therefore, they sent a secret army to the river Yalu. This Chinese army began to attack all the US forces and the UN forces as well as the South Korean forces too. Republic of Korea was the name of the South Korean forces at that point of time. Even though the president's idea was to end the war at the earliest possible, General Douglas MacArthur had different plans to reunify Korea altogether. He took steps against the presidential decision but only failed in the attempt. That made President to have no other choice but to relieve General Douglas MacArthur from command after getting the support from the JCS, that is the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Still, General Douglas MacArthur was remarked as a war hero by then. The support from the JCS further helped Truman to save impeachment from firing. The American casualties. More than 55,000 soldiers were killed during the War of Korea, who were only from the USA. Apart from that, there were so many other locals and Chinese who gone prey to the combat. This particular war was the limited war that did not fully complete and also ended up to be one war where the enemy was not totally defeated at all. Limited goals were achieved in the form of agreement so as to protect the South Korean part. It was rather a rational option resorted by the USA government not to induce a Third World War again. To the contrary, it was a remarkable victory earlier during the World War II for the Americans, where the enemies were destroyed. For the other spectators, the concept of limited war was new relatively. They wondered at the concept, and it was difficult to comprehend from them on what was the ultimate goal of the war. The reason why the Americans involved in the affair is not clearly known to the entire world all now. The reason why there are not amicable pacts happening between the two Korean parts all now is a matter to take into serious consideration too. Naturally, these are vital portions in the history for anyone to pay heed to take a serious note on their own life values too. Reason for the limited wars. Third World War could have happened for sure if that rational decision to agree to cease fire was not taken by the Americans at that point of time. Russia and many other nations by that time have started to have enough in their arsenal to cause catastrophic damages to the enemy nations against what they wage wars. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that was destroyed earlier, was a lesson to the whole world about the war culture. They could easily predict the outcome of a Third World War just in case initiated with the war in Korea. When the scholastic pros and veterans from all over the world were calling for international peace, taking some crucial such decisions became pivotal for the developed nation like the USA. As they have already proved their real prowess to the entire world in the earlier war, it is unnecessary to lose any more soldiers or to destroy any more ignorant lives of the commons unnecessarily in the name of war. The President realized this at that time, Mr. Harry Truman. Even though he was the one who initially triggered the National Security Council to pass on an urgent resolution to provide assistance to the Southern Korean subcontinent, he did not like to extend the war anymore when there were enormous losses incurred already. Losing 55,000 soldiers in war to protect some other country or to do the act of surveillance like cops is not worth it by any means, and that was not supported by any means by United Nations too. Even Russia was not inviting any war again, even though the nation is fully well equipped with some advanced missiles in their arsenal. It was the Korean War which is still considered as a point of evaluation for analysis toward arriving at far more rational decisions rather than what it was done earlier by the predecessors. Therefore, basically, it was all about the international peace and well-being of the human race as a whole more than anything else was. War in Korea split up the country into two parts, and the separation became permanent for the locals to suffer for a long time, even after the war was over. Repercussions of war are not something that has to be spoon-fed as information update to anyone out there, though. It is easily conceivable fact that there are millions of people who were put into worst uncomfortable situations just because of these types of unstable situations prevailing among nations across the world. Still, the scenario is not completely fine or even any better than before in the borderline between North and South Korea, even after so many numbers of years. Technology has grown, and the advancements are so breathtaking in this part of the world, both in South and North Korean parts. Yet the basic need to understand the importance of adjustments, flexibility and adaptation to the needs are not yet grasped appropriately by majority of the policymakers today. Neither the men and women in the creamy layer of the society with powers filled in their hands, nor the commons have due interests to be flexible. They would rather like to lose a few thousand lives for the sake of not bowing down in one way or the other to their own neighbours, who hardly may just be of their own kith and kin. Casualties in Korean War. One of the most interesting details that must be noted down here about the Korean War is the number of casualties. No one cannot appreciate the efforts taken by any country towards raising the issue of war just because of the simple reason that there are numerous lives that are sacrificed unnecessarily in the attempt to bring in peace between any two countries that are in dispute. The major part of the peacekeeping attempt is only to lose lives if it is through wars, and that is the objective of neither the United Nations Security Council nor the USA. Not even the Russian or Chinese counterparts will be willing to destroy human lives in big numbers like that unnecessarily. With that said, the point at issue is to wage wars against terrorism and finding out effective best strategies to curtail it with united efforts from the common people and women out there in majority. Bodo League Massacre. The number of casualties from China in the Korean War alone exceeds more than 300,000. 1/6 of equivalent number of casualties belongs to the USA. From Australia to New Zealand and Thailand, every other nation that participated in the war had casualties to their own count. Yet the biggest numbers belonged to China and USA amidst all the other nations. Even Turkey and UK, to their part, more than 700 casualties each. It means the number of innocent lives that are lost in the name of bringing in peace in between two nations is something that is to be noted with a keen eye for details here. Korean War is the latest classical example for all of us to think about the easy possible demolition of the entire human race altogether as a literal suicide in the form of wars. There is no need for catastrophic destructions to happen around the world to destroy the confidence of the growing nations or the developing countries, or for the entire human race as a whole, as the wars are good enough to do the role quite clearly. Massacres like Jallianwala Bagh are great examples in the history book of records. General Dyer was well known for the massacre, as his tyranny was exposed readily to make him suffer huge losses in turn. Sadly, that was not the only one massacre though. There were massive killings in many parts of the world like that one. Here, in the case of Koreans, only their own emperors, without any intervention of the foreigner, do the massacre, which is the worst part about it. Total number of people who were wounded during the war in Korea exceeds 800,000, which is non-inclusive of the civilians that were accidentally killed. There are no records of accomplishment or stats for the civilians' death. It means the total number of people who died in the war in Korea who are nationals will exceed more than 300,000 in that case, while counting on the soldiers along with the civilians too. Just after the beginning of the war, just a few days after the war, the president of South Korea at that point of time, Ri, ordered the massacre which killed more than 100,000 innocent lives who were suspected to be sympathizers of the communists. Killings included everyone in the families of the individuals suspected to be sympathizers for the communists. This was referred in the history as Bodo League Massacre. Australia and Canada. Troops from Australia and Canada also did participate in the Korean War. The number of casualties from Australia's side included 300 soldiers, and the number of injured exceeded more than 1,000 soldiers. It is the case with Canada too. Equal number of casualties was reported from the Canadians too, and equal number of people approximately was injured in the war as well. The role of other nations like UK and Turkey were quite significant too. If the indulgence of the USA was not that severe, then there would not be this much trouble at all, say experts though, from the Russian side. Yet, if Russia had shown some seriousness too, to take part actively in the war, then that could have been a significant war of the millennium to draw some serious consequences for real. The participation of South Korea, France and Turkey in the war are quite significant too. International peacekeeping force was appointed actually by the United Nations Security Council like a team of cops who take authority to prevent violence or war or wrongdoings happening in any part of the world. The United Nations Security Council condemned North Korea's invasion in that way, and that is the reason more troops from varied nations were sent to fight against the Soviet tanks and the North Korean ammunition. It was as the Pusan Sea the real war began, but only to the sad demise of thousands of lives again. France and Thailand. France had so many people injured in the war to the tune of about 1,000 odd individuals who were sent to Korea between 1951 to 1953. 300 soldiers from France were killed in the Korean War too. Thailand had 200 of their soldiers killed in the attempt and more than 700 people injured too. The casualties are varied at many levels, ranging from minimum to maximum from South Africa to Korea. Koreans were the top to lose in the war more than anyone else was. Thermonuclear bombs proposal. There were proposals to drop the thermonuclear bombs too during the Korean War. Both the presidents dropped the idea not to trigger the World War III. The bombs were only at the testing stage at that point of time, to not give them the complete courage to take these arsenals into their custody completely. If that had happened, then the entire planet Earth could have been a graveyard by all this time now. Pusan perimeter, American troops and the American soldiers who fought near the chosen reservoir and the brave American soldiers fought at the Kunuri Pass lost lives courageously in the war, which led to almost 1/4 of the whole of the Americans participated in the war to have lost their lives completely. It was sad to that extent that in spite of that, they did not totally defeat the enemies in the war, which is a grievance for them only after the big success of the World War II. While sympathizing for the Americans, there comes in the need to sympathize for the others who are involved in the war too, just like the other nationals who are very not related to the war at all. Having born and brought up in one place and taken to a distant foreign land and made to fight for someone else, these soldiers lost their lives somewhere else far from their homeland to make their families shell-shocked. This is the worst part of the war culture, which is not understood by the aristocrats unless and until they are stepping down to wage it on their own throwing blades live in action. Korean War was not just 3 years long, and it is continuing all now. The border is not stable. The war is still on even after so many years, as South Korea has not signed the pact of ceasefire all now yet. Frontline soldiers used by the Americans sadly is the entire dark race, which is one another separate story that might lead to racial domination in that part of the world. There were numerous black American families who hated that trait of the rules at that point of time. Still, there is a grudge amidst majority of the black American families in that way, for they have lost their own near and dear men permanently because of the Korean War. in war for about 3 years or so. Before that, Korea was under the possession of Japan. Just after the Second World War, Korea was purely divided into zones of occupation by the Japanese for trading convenience. In fact, they used it as one of their imperial colonies for a long time, all until granting freedom to the country as a whole. Yet the United States forces finally decided to surrender to the Japanese troops in the South Korea, while the Russian forces decided to do the same there in the North Korea. The temporary division between the zones eventually became a permanent separation, just like how Germany was divided into two earlier. North Korea became a communist regime with the assistance of the Soviet Union against Japan. It was done forcefully to get rid of all those Japanese who lived in the Korean peninsula. Without any brutal military forces, the region was split into two territories in the peninsula. Yet it was not expected to rise into a colossal issue eventually to the heights of the Korean War. Historians are quoting so many reasons for the outbreak of the Korean War. Stalin's influence on the North Korean part was considered as a major reason for the outbreak of the war. At the same time, the concern for China for the USA to have better control of the southern part of Korea was clearly a vivid point not to forget there as well. Is in the nationalism of the locals or the imperialism? The Korean War started in the year 1950. The world nations were suffering from severe crisis after the Second World War, the time converging into one more adversity, that is the Cold War. World nations were in a panic for many catastrophes to hit the humankind artificially sooner or later with the advent of the modern inventions in the name of thermonuclear weaponry. One of the significant wars that has close relations with the Cold War tensions and happened during the Cold War era is the Korean War. Cuban Missile conflicts and the Vietnam Wars intense of the foreign nations that has been a catalyst for the Korean War is a true subject, matter or research even today for the historians. Let us see the intricate details of this significant war in the history of the humankind so far. Korean War between North and South Korea never ended, as there were not any agreeable pacts or peace agreements signed by countries, neither before nor after the war. Armed troops for the communists-packed North Korea arrived at South Korea to set launch the War of Korea. UN controlled and directed USA was quick enough to sprang only to the South Korea's defense to fight a bloody and distressing stats that is more significant. They call it hence to be a forgotten war by the Americans. The media did not expose too much about the Korean War for one reason or the other, just like how it did in the case of the Vietnam War or the Cuban Missile conflicts. Geographical divisions in the country led to the political divisions too, later on to become permanently as two different nations, North Korea and South Korea. USA and USSR agreed to maintain the 38th Parallel Border Pact to guard the South and the North respectively, just after the Second World War. UK, USA and the USSR were the allies in the Second World War who took the decision